Don't seek to please your boss. Seek to do what's best for the company. That line, deceptively simple, almost cold in its clarity, captures the core operating principle of Reed Hastings. It isn't a motivational phrase or a cultural slogan meant to hang on a wall. It's the distilled outcome of decades of mistakes, emotional discomfort, and a deep frustration with how organizations lose their edge. Hastings came to understand that companies don't fail because of one catastrophic blow. They decay slowly, quietly, as people start optimizing for safety instead of truth, for harmony instead of clarity, for pleasing others instead of thinking independently. And nothing terrifies him more than that slow intellectual death. Reed Hastings begins from a weakness, not a strength. Early in his career, he avoids confrontation, avoids telling people what he really thinks, avoids difficult conversations because they feel rude, impolite, destabilizing. That avoidance damages relationships, hurts his first company, and crucially, blinds him to problems until it's too late. At Pure Software, every mistake led to a new rule. Every new rule added a layer of rigidity. And every layer of rigidity made the company slower, less creative, more cautious. Pure became a manual of how to suffocate a company with good intentions. He watched processes multiply, approvals balloon, and fear silently take over. What once felt like a startup became a machine of control, a place where people followed rules instead of thinking, and where he, ironically, had created exactly the environment he never wanted. That trauma becomes the raw material for everything he builds later. It's the origin story of Netflix's culture of freedom and responsibility. Hastings internalizes one hard truth. When you create rules to prevent every possible mistake, you also prevent every possible breakthrough. Processes protect the average performers and suffocate the exceptional ones. Controls reduce anxiety today, but destroy innovation tomorrow. And once the system tilts toward fear, it never tilts back. So when Hastings starts Netflix, he doesn't try to build an efficient company. He tries to build a thinking company. He wants an environment where people act not out of fear of mistakes, but out of ownership of outcomes. The 2001 crisis becomes the turning point. He lays off 1/3 of the company, expecting disaster. Instead, he finds something that feels almost impossible. Productivity goes up, morale increases, creativity explodes. With fewer people, but better people, the company accelerates. That experience rewires his understanding of teams. Hastings realizes that talent density is not a nice-to-have concept. It is the force multiplier that determines the entire trajectory of the organization. Too many mediocre performers drag the company toward process, toward predictability, toward rules that protect them. A concentration of top performers eliminates the need for most rules altogether. From that moment, talent density becomes an obsession. He removes bonuses, tills performance management systems, strips away perks disguised as cultural glue. He doesn't want people motivated by artificial incentives. He wants people motivated by mastery, by impact, by the chance to make high-quality decisions with minimal friction. He pays top of market not to spoil employees, but to eliminate politics. When everyone knows they're paid the most they can get anywhere, compensation disappears as a source of tension, and the only thing left is the work. Equally important is the shift Hastings undergoes personally. Therapy teaches him something he should have learned earlier. Avoiding conflict is not kindness, it's betrayal. Not saying what needs to be said destroys relationships. Not telling the truth destroys teams. In a company, avoiding hard conversations doesn't preserve harmony. It slowly poisons judgment. When Reed embraces candor, he doesn't do it because it feels natural. He does it because the alternative already failed him once. Candor becomes the cultural mechanism that replaces rules. If you want a company where people operate without approvals, without layers of review, without predetermined checklists, then they must share information openly, criticize each other honestly, and confront problems directly. That is why Netflix turns candor into a ritual. Feedback is not optional, it's a duty. People tell the truth publicly, quickly, and without decorating it. Criticizing a senior executive is not a career risk, it's an expectation. Reed trains himself to welcome criticism, not because he enjoys it, but because he knows what happens when leaders become insulated from discomfort. He models vulnerability not as therapy, but as a structural requirement. Leaders must show they can be corrected if they expect others to take risks in speaking up. This system only works if friction is eliminated systematically. Hastings becomes obsessed with eliminating every approval, every gatekeeper, every constraint that slows down the best people. The realization is simple but profound. Organizations create processes to prevent the worst employees from making bad decisions. But those same processes prevent the best employees from making great ones. Reed refuses to let the bottom of the talent pool define the rules for the entire company. When someone makes a careless spending mistake, he doesn't create a new expense policy. He gives them feedback. If a decision goes wrong, he doesn't add a layer of oversight. He increases context. What Reed builds is not a loose or indulgent culture. It's a high-performance system disguised as freedom. The freedom exists only because the people are exceptional, and the responsibility exists only because the freedom is real. Reed eventually stops thinking of Netflix as a company and starts thinking of it as a cognitive system, a system designed to improve the quality of decisions faster than competitors can react. That is why transparency becomes a non-negotiable pillar. Reed shares financial data internally, strategic documents, market risks, competitive threats, everything short of what is legally restricted. Not because he wants to build trust with openness, but because autonomy cannot function without context. If you're going to make decisions without asking permission, you need access to the same information the CEO has. Without transparency, freedom is chaos. With transparency, freedom becomes a strategic weapon. Decision-making distributes downward. Authority flows to the person with the most context, not the highest title. People sign million-dollar contracts without approval. Teams greenlight large strategic bets. Directors make content decisions that would require CEO involvement in any traditional media company. Reed steps back not because he is humble, but because he realizes for Netflix to move faster than anyone else, he must become increasingly irrelevant in day-to-day
until it
decisions.
doesn't. Quickster exposes the Achilles heel of even the strongest culture. The failure didn't happen because people lacked talent. It happened because people stayed silent. Reed interprets silence not as respect, but as betrayal of the culture. If you disagree and say nothing, you're not being polite, you're endangering the company. That moment becomes a permanent scar in the culture. Candor is not optional, disagreement is not optional. Dissent is not an act of rebellion, but an act of loyalty. If you think the company is making a mistake, you must say so, or you are responsible for the outcome. What makes Reed Hastings unique is not his confidence, it's the way he weaponizes his own weaknesses. Everything he builds at Netflix is a counterstrike against who he used to be. The man who avoided conflict now institutionalizes conflict. The man who added rules to fix mistakes now eliminates rules to prevent decay. The man who ran a company that became rigid now builds one that reinvents itself every few years. Netflix isn't designed to be comfortable. It's designed to think. It's designed to be fast. It's designed to evolve. And that evolution traces back to the moment Reed realized that the greatest risk for a growing company is not chaos, it's stagnation disguised as professionalism. What becomes increasingly clear is that Hastings is not building a culture of freedom, he is building a culture of judgment. Freedom is merely the external expression of something deeper, a relentless insistence that people think independently, reason clearly, and act without waiting for permission. Most companies cling to process because they don't trust their people to make good decisions. Netflix eliminates process because it refuses to hire people who need it. Hastings designs the system backward from a single assumption. When you hire exceptionally capable adults, you can treat them like exceptionally capable adults. The entire culture is an experiment in discovering how far you can push autonomy when everyone is expected to operate with discipline, intelligence, and honesty. Candor becomes the operating system that makes the autonomy possible. Reed sees feedback not as a nicety, but as a safety mechanism. In a world without approvals or committees, the only way to prevent bad decisions from compounding is to create an environment where people correct each other fast, publicly, and without ego. The purpose of candor is not emotional transparency, it's decision hygiene, it's organizational clarity, it's the removal of distortion. In most companies, truth degrades as it rises through the hierarchy. Hastings inverts the system so truth accelerates instead. The faster the truth moves, the faster the company adapts. And if the company adapts faster than competitors, it wins. But candor also has a cost. It demands emotional resilience. It demands that people detach their identity from their work, not in a cold way, but in a professional way. If someone tells you your idea is weak, that's not an attack on your value as a person, it's a contribution to the quality of the outcome. This is a difficult shift for many. It requires a level of maturity that most organizations do not cultivate. Netflix refuses to lower the standard. In this environment, fragility becomes a liability. The work is too fast, too consequential, too intellectually demanding to manage egos delicately. People either adapt or they leave. And Hastings believes that both outcomes are good for the system. The role of transparency grows in parallel with candor. Reed exposes the internal workings of the company because he knows that decentralized decision-making fails without shared context. If everyone is expected to act like a leader, they must be armed with the same depth of information leaders have. It's not about treating people like insiders, it's about equipping them to act without asking. This is why Netflix employees have access to financial details, strategic debates, risk assessments, internal memos, information that at most companies is tightly controlled. Transparency is not a cultural flourish, it is an infrastructural requirement for speed. The contrast to Pure software is staggering. At Pure, growth produced bureaucracy. At Netflix, growth produces clarity. At Pure, mistakes produced process. At Netflix, mistakes produce learning. Reed internalized the lesson that process grows like mold, fast, quietly, and destructively. It accumulates because leaders are afraid of being blamed for errors. Hastings realized that the cost of eliminating blame is far lower than the cost of eliminating autonomy. So he reframes mistakes. They don't require prevention, they require exposure, public exposure, sunshining. He forces the organization to discuss errors openly, not as scar tissue to hide, but as raw material to analyze. The point is not to feel shame, the point is to refine decision-making. This philosophy becomes most visible in how the company handles creative bets. When Netflix moves into original content, the stakes are enormous. House of Cards is not simply a show, it is a declaration of independence from the traditional licensing model. The decision involves massive investment, potential backlash, and a strategic pivot. Yet the decision does not rise through committees to Reed's desk. It originates in a team with context, conviction, and autonomy. Hastings' role is not to give approval. His role is to ensure they have the information needed to understand the risk and the authority to act on it. The bet pays off, but what matters is not the success, it's the mechanism. Netflix proves it can make billion-dollar decisions without the founder's involvement. That is the dream of a system builder, to architect a company so strong that brilliance emerges from the structure, not from the genius of one person. Still, autonomy has limits, and Quickster reveals those limits brutally. For all the idealism of freedom, people froze. They stayed quiet. They let a bad idea pass through unchallenged. That silence was the real failure, not the strategy. Hastings sees something dangerous: silence masquerading as alignment. And the correction is sharp. In Netflix's culture, disagreement is not bravery, it is duty. You must voice your perspective even if it creates conflict, even if it challenges authority, even if it contradicts the CEO. The moment people start optimizing for harmony, the culture collapses back into the patterns that suffocated Pure. Reed turns Quickster into a case study, a scar made visible so the company never repeats the mistake. Most leaders try to bury their embarrassing moments. Hastings institutionalizes
pushes these ideas into new territory. Candor, autonomy, and talent density are easy to preach, but hard to export. Cultural norms fight back. In some countries, direct feedback is considered rude. In others, challenging authority is taboo. In others, compensation structures are governed by local laws that conflict with Netflix's top-of-market philosophy. Reed adapts, but selectively. He adjusts the delivery, not the essence. The expectation of honesty remains. The expectation of excellence remains. The expectation of accountability remains. The system bends but does not break. Netflix learns to translate its culture across borders without diluting it. And that is a rare achievement. Most companies globalize by adopting the lowest common denominator. Netflix globalizes by preserving its highest standard. Through all of this, something deeper emerges. Reed Hastings is not trying to scale himself, he's trying to eliminate himself. He wants the company to think independently of him. He wants the culture to operate without his constant involvement. He wants decisions to be made by those closest to the information, not closest to the power. This mindset is unusual for founders who often unconsciously centralize authority. But Reed's trauma from Pure left him with a certainty. The moment he becomes the bottleneck, the company begins to slow down. His legacy is not his judgment, it's the system he designed to scale judgment across the organization. Netflix becomes a place where thinking is the job, where speed is the output, where honesty is the mechanism, where excellence is the entry price, and where Reed Hastings paradoxically becomes more effective the less central he is. What fascinates most observers is that Hastings doesn't idealize his culture. He doesn't present Netflix as a utopia of empowered employees. He's brutally honest about the cost. A culture built on radical candor is exhausting. A culture built on top talent creates relentless pressure. A culture built on constant reinvention destabilizes anyone who craves predictability. And a culture built on personal responsibility leaves no room to hide. Reed knows this, and he accepts it because he believes the alternative is far worse. A slow, polite, process-heavy company is a company preparing its own obituary. He isn't interested in creating psychological comfort. He is interested in creating organizational clarity. And clarity often requires discomfort. The keeper test is one of the clearest expressions of this philosophy. Ask yourself, if this person were considering leaving, would you fight hard to keep them? If the answer is no, you should pay them a generous severance and move on. It's a cold question, but it cuts through all the noise. It ignores likability, tenure, loyalty, and sentimentality. It focuses entirely on impact.
In most companies, people stay because they aren't failing badly enough to be removed. In Netflix, you stay only if you elevate the work. The absence of mediocre performance is not enough. The presence of exceptional contribution is the expectation. It's a meritocracy in its purest and harshest form. But Hastings doesn't use this mechanism to create fear. He uses it to create honesty. Managers cannot hide behind half-truths, performance reviews, or vague feedback. They must confront reality. They must tell people directly whether they are truly top talent. The tension this creates is intentional. The price of talent density is discomfort, and the payoff is a team where everyone trusts that the people standing beside them are exceptional. Reed believes that this level of intensity is not just a cultural preference, it's a strategic necessity. If you want, people do not flourish in systems built around the average. The transparency that supports this meritocracy goes far beyond what most leaders would tolerate. Reed shares strategic plans, financial projections, market threats, internal disagreements, almost everything short of legally restricted information. He knows transparency is risky. Information can leak, competitors can learn, journalists can misinterpret. But he believes the risk of secrecy is greater. Without transparency, autonomy collapses. People cannot make high-quality decisions if they do not understand the full picture. So he accepts the trade-off. He believes in treating employees like adults, with all the complexity that entails. The openness is not a perk, it is the backbone of the system. This is why Netflix employees are expected to think like owners. They are expected to spend money as if it were their own. They are expected to challenge ideas regardless of who originated them. They are expected to move fast without waiting for approval, and they are expected to accept accountability for the outcomes. There is no safety net of process, no shield of bureaucracy, no place to hide incompetence or indecision. Reed believes real creativity and real innovation come from people who have the room and the responsibility to act without constraints. Yet this freedom exposes cracks. The failures are not swept under the rug, they are examined under bright lights. The marketing fiasco in Turkey, for example, becomes a case study. An autonomous team, acting with good intentions, created a campaign that clashed with cultural sensitivities and sparked backlash. In a traditional company, this would lead to new layers of approval and more centralized control. Reed refuses. He insists that the failure is not a reason to build bureaucracy, but a reason to deepen understanding. Mistakes are expected. They are not excuses to retreat into process, they are data points for improvement. This approach to failure contrasts sharply with Quickster, where the problem wasn't autonomy, it was silence. Reed is willing to tolerate bad bets, but he cannot tolerate withheld truth. Silence breaks the feedback loop. Silence prevents learning. Silence rots the culture from within. So he doubles down on candor. He formalizes feedback rituals. He normalizes difficult conversations. He raises the standard of communication. If autonomy is the engine, candor is the steering mechanism. Without it, the car crashes. The global expansion of Netflix amplifies these dynamics. Different cultures interpret candor differently. In some places, direct feedback feels disrespectful. In others, challenging authority is socially dangerous. But Reed insists that the core principles must remain, even if the style adapts. The goal is not to export American bluntness. The goal is to export intellectual honesty. Netflix's culture becomes less about tone and more about truth. Less about format and more about clarity. Less about comfort and more about correctness. And yet, Hastings is not naive about the limits of freedom. He recognizes that certain parts of the business, finance, security, legal compliance, require formal rules. Freedom without boundaries in those domains would be catastrophic. So he preserves small pockets of structure, like bones in an otherwise flexible organism. These pockets aren't contradictions, they are reinforcements. Reed's brilliance is not in rejecting rules wholesale, but in knowing exactly where rules are necessary and where they are destructive. He is not anarchistic.
Netflix
He is
evolves
selective.
into something unusual.
an organization that becomes faster as it grows. Most companies slow down with scale. Decision-making becomes politicized, creativity becomes diluted, responsibility becomes fragmented. Hastings designs Netflix to invert this trajectory. Growth brings more talent, more transparency, more autonomy. The system compounds, it accelerates, it becomes cognitively dense. And this density becomes its competitive advantage. Competitors can copy features, they can copy prices, they can copy strategy, but very few can copy the willingness to confront truth, remove rules, eliminate politics, and demand excellence at every level of the organization. Reed Hastings' transformation from a conflict-avoidant founder to an architect of one of the most intellectually demanding cultures in the world is not accidental. It is the byproduct of a lifetime of realizing that organizations fail not because people make mistakes, but because they stop telling the truth. His culture is not an embrace of freedom. It is a rejection of fear. It is a refusal to let caution, politeness, or hierarchy dilute thought. Netflix is the physical manifestation of that refusal. And beneath it all is the same idea that opened this story: doing what's best for the company, not for your boss, not for your ego, not for your sense of safety. That, for Reed Hastings, is the only North Star that matters. What becomes undeniable is that Hastings is not leading people, he is leading a system. His genius is not charisma, it is design. He is not trying to inspire the organization emotionally, he is engineering it structurally. He wants a culture where good judgment emerges naturally from the environment, not as a function of his approval. And the more he refines the system, the more the organization can operate without him. It's the opposite of the heroic founder story. Reed does not want to be indispensable. He wants to be unnecessary. He realizes early that the most dangerous bottleneck in any growing company is the CEO. The more decisions flow through him, the more constrained the company becomes. So he begins removing himself deliberately. He stops being the approval gate. He stops being the central strategist. He stops being the protector of ideas. Instead, he becomes the designer of the context in which ideas live or die on their own merit. That shift from being the central node to being just one node is what allows Netflix to scale its thinking. Reed's goal is not to scale himself, it is to make scaling himself irrelevant. By distributing decision-making, Reed forces people to behave like leaders, not in title, but in responsibility. Anyone can make a high-stakes decision if they have context. Anyone can question a strategic move if their reasoning is sound. Anyone can push back against consensus if they see a blind spot. This redistribution of power destroys the politics that plague traditional organizations. Politics thrive where decisions are scarce and power is centralized. Netflix flips the equation. Power is abundant because responsibility is abundant. Politics become pointless. But giving away power does not make a company faster on its own. Speed comes from something deeper, the removal of fear. Fear is the great slowing agent. Fear of making a mistake, fear of upsetting a superior, fear of losing status, fear of not being liked. Reed spends years removing fear from the culture, not by protecting people, but by exposing them to truth, by normalizing conflict, by celebrating directness, by rewarding those who speak up even when their opinion is unpopular. A fearless culture is not a loud culture, it is an intellectually honest one, and honesty is the shortest distance between confusion and clarity. This is why Netflix is able to reinvent itself so aggressively. Moving from DVDs to streaming required a willingness to cannibalize the core business. Most companies hesitate. Most companies cling to what made them successful. Reed understands that clinging is death. He has seen what happens to organizations that protect the past instead of designing the future. So the company pivots early, boldly, almost recklessly. And once the shift to streaming stabilizes, Netflix pivots again, this time into original content. Where other companies fear the cost, Netflix fears irrelevance. Reed believes that if you are not rewriting your business, someone else is writing your obituary. These reinventions are not acts of bravado, they are acts of cultural inevitability. A company built on truth-telling, autonomy, and talent density cannot sit still. It is wired to change because its people are wired to question, and questioning leads to evolution. Netflix does not reinvent itself because Reed commands it. It reinvents itself because the culture makes stagnation impossible. The global expansion tests the system in ways Reed never anticipated. When the company enters markets with rigid labor laws or deeply hierarchical cultural norms, the Netflix model encounters friction. But Reed never confuses friction with failure. He knows cultural translation requires nuance. He knows candor looks different in Japan than in Brazil. He knows autonomy feels risky in markets accustomed to top-down rules. But he also knows that the core cannot bend. He allows the delivery to adapt, not the principle. You can soften the tone, but not the truth. You can shift the structure, but not the standard. You can adjust how feedback is spoken, but not whether it is spoken. That consistency is what allows Netflix to maintain its identity even as it stretches across 190 countries. Yet Reed is clear about one thing. Freedom is not the point. Responsibility is the point. Freedom is simply the byproduct of responsibility. When you give people extreme responsibility, you must also give them the freedom to act on it. Anything else is incoherent. Traditional companies reverse the equation. They restrict freedom and hope responsibility emerges. Netflix does the opposite. It grants freedom and demands responsibility. That inversion changes everything. It creates a workplace where initiative is the norm and permission is irrelevant, where decisions are made by those who understand them best, not by those who sit highest. The result is an organization that many people find intimidating. There is nowhere to hide incompetence, nowhere to bury mediocrity, nowhere to escape accountability. But for those who thrive, it is liberating. It is exhilarating. It is the rare environment where your impact is limited only by your clarity of thought. The company becomes a magnet for people who crave intellectual challenge, who are not satisfied with adequacy, who view discomfort as a stimulus
this entire
rather than a
evolution,
threat.
the most striking transformation is in Reed himself. The founder who once avoided conflict becomes the curator of conflict. The man who let rigid processes multiply becomes the destroyer of bureaucracy. The CEO who once wanted control becomes the architect of distributed authority. Reed's personal growth becomes the blueprint for the company's growth. His fears become warnings, his regrets become guardrails, his failures become cultural doctrine. The trauma of pure software becomes the antidote that shapes Netflix's DNA. Everything ultimately returns to the idea that opened this script, doing what's best for the company, not for your boss, not for your ego, not for your image. In a culture built on truth and talent, loyalty does not mean obedience. It means clarity. It means courage. It means thinking independently, even when the room disagrees. It means refusing to let the organization slip into the comfortable patterns that once destroyed Reed's first company. Netflix is not the story of a founder with a bold vision. It is the story of a founder who built a system designed to catch every flaw he once embodied. And that system, in the end, becomes stronger than the man who created it. As the company matures, Hastings becomes more like an editor than a commander. He trims, adjusts, shapes the culture the way a writer shapes a manuscript, removing what dulls the narrative, strengthening what sharpens the meaning. He watches for drift. Drift is the silent killer of organizations. Drift away from candor, drift away from autonomy, drift toward politics, drift toward comfort, drift toward process disguised as professionalism. Reed becomes hypersensitive to these early warning signs. Whenever he senses the culture softening, he intervenes not with new rules, but with reminders of the principles that built the company in the first place. One of the most important reminders is the practice of uncomfortably leading with context. Reed repeats this idea not because it sounds elegant, but because it prevents the very trap that destroyed pure software. When leaders give control, people need to understand why decisions matter, not just what they should do. Control without context is chaos. Context without control is bureaucracy. The power lies in combining them. When someone proposes an idea at Netflix, the evaluation is not, do I approve, but do they have the full context to understand the consequences?
This is a profound shift in decision-making. It shifts responsibility from the hierarchy to the individual. It shifts authority from the title to the reasoning. This reasoning becomes essential as the company enters the era of original content. Creative work is notoriously difficult to manage. Traditional studios rely on layers of development executives, approval chains, and iterative rewrites. Netflix does the opposite. It hands massive budgets to teams and trusts them to deliver. The logic is simple. Creativity suffocates under control. It thrives under responsibility. The autonomy given to creators is not indulgence, it is a bet that talented people produce their best work when they are trusted, not supervised. And Netflix has the data to justify this. When House of Cards proves successful, the company realizes that trusting the judgment of teams with context can outperform the slow, cautious methods of Hollywood. But autonomy creates inequality. Some bets will succeed spectacularly. Others will fail publicly. Hastings accepts this imbalance. He has no interest in smoothing outcomes. He is interested in maximizing the potential of outliers. Reed operates with a venture capitalist's mindset. One big win justifies a dozen small failures. The culture reflects this. People are encouraged to make bold decisions, not safe ones. Safe decisions do not change industries. Bold decisions do. The purpose of freedom is not efficiency, it is magnitude. It is the pursuit of ideas that reshape the market rather than protect the status quo. This philosophy becomes even more critical as competition intensifies. When Disney, Amazon, Apple, and countless regional platforms entered the streaming war, the instinct for most companies would be to tighten control, reduce risk, and retreat into process. Reed moves in the opposite direction. He believes the only defense against larger, richer, more resource-heavy competitors is speed. Speed of experimentation, speed of learning, speed of adaptation. And speed can only exist where trust and autonomy exist. Bureaucracy is too slow. Committees are too slow. Approval chains are too slow. The only way to outrun giants is to think faster than they can move. And thinking faster requires intellectual honesty. This is why Reed obsesses over feedback, not as a performance evaluation tool, but as a truth propagation system. A company cannot adapt if the truth is distorted, delayed, or silenced. Most leaders say they want feedback, but secretly fear it. They treat criticism as an attack. Reed treats it as a diagnostic. Criticism shows where the thinking is flawed. Silence hides the flaw until it becomes fatal. He insists that feedback must be specific, actionable, and frequent. He insists that it must move in all directions, not just downward. He insists that challenging him is not a privilege, it is a responsibility. And over time, this creates an unusual environment. Reed Hastings becomes one of the least powerful CEOs in the world. Teams disagree with him openly. They override his preferences. They challenge his instincts. And he celebrates it because the goal is not to be right. The goal is for the company to arrive at the right answer. His ego is subordinated to the system. Most founders cannot make this shift. They become trapped by their identity. They believe the company is an extension of themselves. Reed does not. He believes the company is an organism that must outgrow him. The culture is designed with that end in mind. The deeper one looks into Reed's leadership, the more it becomes clear that everything flows from a single psychological evolution. Early Reed believed that harmony mattered. Mature Reed believes that clarity matters. Early Reed believed that process created stability. Mature Reed believed that process creates decay. Early Reed believed that avoiding conflict preserved relationships. Mature Reed believes that avoiding conflict destroys organizations. His entire life becomes a study of the dangers of good intentions executed with weak thinking. Netflix becomes the antidote to those weaknesses. A place where uncomfortable truths are aired before they metastasize, where risk is taken before opportunity disappears, and where excellence is demanded before mediocrity accumulates. Reed becomes more reflective about the paradox he created. A company built on freedom demands more discipline from employees than any rule-heavy organization ever could. A company built on candor is emotionally harder than most polite workplaces. A company built on responsibility feels less secure than companies built on control. The very things that make Netflix effective make it difficult. The culture is not for everyone, and Reed never tries to make it for everyone. He is unapologetic about the fact that only a certain type of person will thrive there. That honesty is rare in a world where companies brand themselves as families and promise comfort they cannot sustainably provide. But Reed understands something fundamental. Organizations become what they tolerate. If you tolerate mediocrity, you become mediocre. If you tolerate politics, you become political. If you tolerate silence, you become blind. If you tolerate rules that protect the weak, you weaken the strong. Netflix refuses to tolerate anything that compromises its ability to think clearly and act decisively. It is not kindness that drives this refusal. It is survival. Reed structures the culture not to be pleasant, but to be durable. And durability requires truth, talent, and trust. Three forces that do not coexist easily, but when engineered correctly, make a company uniquely formidable. The power of Reed Hastings lies in his willingness to strip away every comforting illusion about management. He rejects the idea that process creates excellence. He rejects the idea that harmony creates loyalty. He rejects the idea that hierarchy creates order. He replaces these illusions with something harder, sharper, and far more effective. A culture where people operate without fear, where decisions are made without waiting, and where truth moves faster than politics. Netflix becomes the physical expression of that philosophy. A company built not on the brilliance of one man, but on the brilliance of a system designed to elevate the thinking of everyone inside it. And all of it returns, in the end, to that simple, almost severe principle: do what is best for the company. Not what is safest, not what is most acceptable, not what flatters authority, but what is best. That principle, applied consistently, relentlessly, unapologetically, becomes the architecture of Netflix and the legacy of Reed Hastings. And now the story folds back to where it began. That line, "Don't seek to please your boss, seek to do what's best for the company," was never about rebellion. It was never about disregarding authority or about encouraging lone wolf behavior. It was about clarity. About stripping away the confusion that infects organizations when people begin optimizing for anything other than truth. Reed Hastings learned the hard way that when employees prioritize safety, harmony, or appearance, the organization begins to rot from the inside. Decisions get distorted, information gets filtered, leaders get insulated, the past gets protected, and the future gets ignored. Netflix is his rejection of all those tendencies. It is his argument that the only loyalty that matters is loyalty to the mission. The only protection worth having is the protection of clear thinking. The only real alignment comes from the pursuit of what is objectively best, even when it is uncomfortable. Throughout his career, Reed becomes increasingly aware that most organizations aren't defeated by external competition, they're defeated by internal psychology. Fear, insecurity, ego, status, politics, and avoidance do far more damage than any market shift or technological rival. The battles companies lose are almost always fought inside conference rooms, not on the battlefield. That realization shapes everything he builds. Netflix becomes a culture engineered to minimize the influence of those human distortions, not by pretending people are perfect, but by creating structures that expose imperfection quickly. A place where ideas collide openly instead of quietly accumulating risk. A place where decisions are owned, not delegated. A place where people speak the truth before the truth becomes too expensive to confront. Reed's evolution is what makes the story coherent. The shy, conflict-averse founder who once avoided difficult conversations is the same person who later insists that candor is non-negotiable. The young CEO who once allowed process to metastasize is the same one who later destroys any rule that no longer serves the mission. The leader who once tolerated comfort is the same one who later demands excellence with almost surgical detachment. Netflix is not the story of a man who always knew what he was doing. It is the story of a man who refused to repeat the same mistake twice. Every cultural principle he champions, freedom with responsibility, top of market pay, talent density, context over control, radical transparency, is a correction to a deficiency he once embodied. As the company grows and the stakes rise, Hastings becomes far more philosophical. He understands now that building a high-performance company is not about brilliance. Brilliance is inconsistent. It fluctuates. It relies on mood, ego, and energy. Systems are what scale. Systems are what endure. Systems are what convert the thinking of a few extraordinary individuals into a collective capability. Reed's true creation is not Netflix as a business. It is Netflix as a decision-making machine. A machine that produces clarity by design. A machine that adapts faster than its competitors because it removes the frictions that slow them down. A machine that keeps reinventing itself because no one inside it is attached to the past. This machine, with all its intensity and sharpness, is not warm. It is not comforting. It is not meant to feel like a family. Families are built on unconditional acceptance. High-performance cultures are built on conditional trust. Trust earned by judgment, by discipline, by contribution. Reed never pretends otherwise. He does not package the culture with sentimental branding or soft promises. He is honest about the cost, and that honesty is what gives the culture its credibility. Netflix employees know exactly what is expected of them. They know why the bar is high. They know that excellence is not a slogan. It is the minimum standard. And they choose to be there not because it's easy, but because it forces them to operate at their intellectual limit. As Reed steps further back from day-to-day operations, the system continues without him. That is the ultimate validation. The culture does not weaken. The thinking does not slow. The autonomy does not collapse. The company does not revert to safety. It stays sharp. It stays fast. It stays uncomfortable in the way high-performance organisms must be. He built something that could outgrow him, and then he let it. It is the opposite of founder ego.
In the
It
final
is founder
analysis,
maturity.
the most striking aspect of Reed Hastings is not his willingness to break rules, but his willingness to break himself. To abandon old habits, old assumptions, old desires for harmony, old fears of conflict. He evolves so the company can evolve. He becomes harder so the organization can become clearer. He becomes less central so the system can become more powerful. His leadership is less about charisma and more about subtraction. Subtracting everything that once made him the bottleneck, removing processes that slowed thinking, removing fear that slowed communication, removing himself as the source of answers. And what remains, after all this subtraction, is a culture that pushes people to operate with the sharpness and honesty that most companies will never tolerate. This is why the opening line matters so much. Don't seek to please your boss. Seek to do what's best for the company. It is not a suggestion. It is the foundation. It is the anchor that keeps the entire system aligned. It ensures that decisions are evaluated against the mission, not against hierarchy. That people speak truth to power, not truth to comfort. That the organization keeps moving forward even when the movement is painful. In a company built on freedom and responsibility, this principle is the only safeguard against chaos. It is the only compass strong enough to navigate global expansion, creative risk, technological reinvention, and competitive warfare. And so, the story closes where it began, with a single idea that acts less like advice and more like a demand for intellectual integrity. Great companies are not built by people who seek approval. They are built by people who pursue clarity, who confront reality, who tell the truth even when it cuts, who think independently even when it contradicts authority. Reed Hastings built a culture that turns these traits into organizational law, and in doing so, he demonstrated one of the most important truths in business. A company's greatest advantage is not technology, capital, or strategy. It is the quality of thought inside the building. Everything else is downstream from that.